Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now, Simone had a way of walking into a room like it owed her something, her heels announcing her before her lips even moved. She was not the type who waited to be admired. She drew admiration from the air like it belonged to her by birthright. In Greystone City, where the streetlights flickered like ambition and pretenses wore designer coats, Simone had climbed her way from the cramped back office of a customer care department to the stylish lounges of corporate events, all without ever learning to type above 40 words per minute. She didn't need to. Her skills lay in how she spoke, how she smiled, how she watched a man the way a tailor measured a client, slowly, with intent, already imagining the final cut. Derek had been one of those men. She met him on a rainy Thursday, his umbrella stuck in the revolving door of the company's parking tower. He had barked at the wind like it owed him a refund, and Simone had laughed, loud enough to be heard but soft enough to seem accidental. That laugh had been the opening. That day, she offered him a tissue. A week later, she was sharing his lunch. 2 months in, she was the name flashing on his phone while his wife sent polite messages about dinner. Simone called it destiny, not adultery. She told her best friend that love didn't always wear the same clothes, and sometimes God delivers blessings in unlikely packages, even if the package is already married. To Simone, Elaine, the wife, was just packaging, old stock on a shelf, dusted occasionally but long out of season. And like any woman who thought youth was a weapon, Simone wielded it like a dagger dipped in lipstick. Derek was the kind of man who bought silence with perfume and kept secrets in perfume-laced bedsheets. He wore guilt like an invisible cologne, strong, but only noticeable to those close enough to inhale. In public, he was every inch the professional, his voice a steady stream of corporate melody, his smile never too wide, never too cold. But behind closed doors, he was the kind of man who complimented Simone while complaining about Elaine in the same breath. She doesn't understand ambition, he said one evening while feeding Simone strawberries from a crystal bowl in a high-rise suite neither of them owned. She gave up her career because of her anxiety. Now, she just paints, journals, and stares at the sky like it'll answer her. Simone would giggle, as if pain was a punchline. She saw Elaine as the old wallpaper in a room waiting to be remodeled. "You deserve better," Simone would whisper, her fingers tracing the edge of his tie, eyes glowing with the self-assured belief that she was better. To Derek, the affair was a cushion against the dullness of marriage. To Simone, it was the blueprint of a throne she was building, one bedroom at a time. But beyond the wine-glass glimmers and the rented romance, cracks began to form in the illusion. Derek stopped making bold promises and started talking in half-finished thoughts. Maybe one day he would say, his hand on her waist, his eyes on his phone. Still, Simone doubled down. She started posting vague captions on social media, cropped dinner plates, hotel slippers, city views at midnight, all breadcrumbs for a story she thought was almost ready for the world. She was certain it was only a matter of time before Elaine became a paragraph in Derek's past. What she didn't know was that Elaine was no paragraph. She was a chapter still being written in a different ink entirely. Far away from Simone's curated world of filters and fantasies, Elaine moved like the breeze, silent but impossible to ignore when it passed. She wasn't the type to compete, and she certainly wasn't the type to beg. When she felt the shift in Derek's presence, when his hugs started to feel like formalities and his eyes danced too quickly past hers, she didn't scream. She didn't throw things or hack his phone. Instead, she returned to the one thing she had always done better than anyone: prepare. Elaine had lived through storms and written poems about the silence that followed. She knew better than to fight in public what could be won in private. So while Simone painted herself as the future, Elaine quietly rewrote her own. She reached out to a man she hadn't spoken to in years, Hugo James, her old mentor from her finance days. He was now the CEO of a growing tech property firm looking to invest in strategic partnerships. Elaine offered him more than money. She offered vision. And Hugo, a man who had seen the shallow and the sincere, chose vision. They began meeting regularly, first on Zoom, then in person. Derek never noticed. He thought Elaine was working on herself again, like she used to when life pressed too hard. He had no idea that his wife had begun mapping an empire while he chased a shadow in stilettos. Elaine didn't tell anyone. She moved like a woman who understood the worth of a delayed announcement. While Simone tried to trend in small corners of the internet, Elaine positioned herself to stand in rooms Simone didn't even know existed, and in the quiet of her study, she would sometimes pause her spreadsheet, lift her head, and whisper, "Not everything needs thunder to be felt." By the time the company announced its upcoming hotel launch, a lavish branding event for investors and media, Simone had already made herself indispensable. She flirted with the idea of being the unofficial face of the firm, suggesting marketing angles and tagging Derek in cryptic posts that read like diary entries laced with perfume. The event was scheduled at one of Greystone's most luxurious waterfront hotels. Simone got fitted for a custom gold dress with a dramatic slit, her hair styled in cascading waves meant to echo royalty. She called it the unveiling. What she didn't know was that her moment of revelation had already been booked by someone else. Behind the velvet curtain of planning and PR, Hugo James had insisted on a special guest of honor, his new strategic partner and personal advisor. He didn't reveal her identity publicly, not even to Derek, who was too busy managing campaign logistics and brushing off his wife's growing quiet confidence at home. When he asked Elaine if she'd like to attend, she smiled and said, "I already have an invitation." That answer haunted him, though he didn't know why. Simone, on the other hand, was floating. She stood in front of mirrors, rehearsing poses. "They'll remember this dress," she said to herself. "They'll remember me." And indeed they would, but not for the reasons she imagined. The night was coming, the night shame would wear heels, and pride would swallow its own reflection. The evening air in Greystone carried the scent of ambition, freshly polished floors, soft jazz floating beneath chandelier light, and the mingling perfume of women who'd come dressed not just to impress, but to conquer. Simone arrived 30 minutes before the official start of the launch, her heels striking the marble with a rhythm that dared the world to look away. Her gown, a rich golden silk that clung to her like praise to ego, shimmered with each calculated step. Makeup flawless, shoulders arched like royalty, she entered the venue flanked by two junior assistants tasked with fussing over her every move. She had no title at the firm, no official role beyond +1, but tonight she made sure her presence roared louder than any announcement. She greeted staff like she owned shares, and greeted guests like she was choosing which one would be photographed next to her. Cameras flickered, conversations paused, and eyes followed. Simone soaked it in like a flower basking in spotlight. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she imagined Elaine curled up in their apartment with a face mask and a cheap novel, oblivious to the stardust Simone now danced in. But if envy was a blade, Simone didn't feel it. She believed the crown had shifted, and she wore it with the smug grace of someone too new to understand that crowns don't rest on vanity, they settle on substance. As the ballroom filled and the speeches began, she stood next to Derek, hand grazing his, flashing her teeth for the camera like a queen marking her territory. But pride, like a poorly sewn seam, will always come undone in the wrong light. In a private room several floors above the event, Elaine adjusted a single silver earring and gave her reflection one last look, not for vanity's sake, but for closure. Her gown was black, not the mourning kind, but the kind that whispered elegance. No sparkle, no plunges, just fabric that flowed like ink on parchment, quiet but confident. She took a deep breath, not because of nerves, but because tonight was not about revenge. It was about revelation. Hugo entered the room, checked his watch, and offered her his arm like a gentleman from another era. They didn't need to speak. The rhythm of their silence had matured into a harmony only understood by those who had survived storms without shouting. As they stepped into the elevator, Elaine recalled the journal entry she had written 3 months ago. If I ever return to the places where I was once overlooked, let it be as someone who rewrote her own story. When the elevator doors parted and they descended into the grand hall, no trumpet announced their arrival, but something shifted. Like wind entering a closed room, heads turned even before they saw her. It wasn't her dress, her posture, or even her beauty. It was the calm she wore like armor, the kind of grace only possessed by women who had cried without witnesses and risen without noise. As Hugo escorted her into the light of the chandeliers, their steps were steady. The host raised a hand, the microphone buzzed, and then came the words that sliced the room in two. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome our new strategic partner, the woman behind the scenes of our next innovation wave, Mrs. Elaine Orton. And just like that, the woman who'd once been reduced to whispers stood at the center of every gaze, untouched by the panic now blooming in Simone's eyes. Simone blinked twice, then once more, like someone waking from a dream they thought was permanent. The sound of applause rang around her, but it felt like thunder crashing against glass walls. Her hands, just moments ago wrapped around Derek's arm, now hung awkwardly by her side. Her smile cracked, barely, but enough. She stared at the stage, at Elaine, and for the first time, her confidence didn't hold. She wanted to tell herself that Elaine was only invited as a guest, a figurehead, a token gesture. But as Hugo continued, speaking of vision and leadership, of Elaine's portfolio and insight, reality dawned like cold water on hot skin. She had not just returned. She had arrived. And she hadn't come alone. People who had earlier posed beside Simone now turned toward the stage, whispering and nodding in approval. The photographer, who had been focusing on her gown detail earlier, subtly shifted toward the CEO and his partner. Derek stood motionless, his lips pressed thin, his hands loosely clasped. He didn't reach for Simone. He didn't speak. If the ground had opened beneath her, she might have preferred it to the stillness of standing there, visible and irrelevant all at once. The confidence she once wore like perfume now clung to her skin like shame. She tried to hold her posture, arch her back, flick her hair, but something had shifted, an invisible thread snapped. She had walked into the room like a hurricane in heels, but now she stood like the aftermath, dazzling but displaced. Elaine's voice rang through the room with the softness of velvet and the strength of thunder veiled in silk. She didn't gloat. She didn't glance at Simone, not even for a flicker. Instead, she spoke about growth, reinvention, and what it meant to lose oneself only to discover a better version waiting in the ashes. I used to believe that silence meant weakness, she said calmly, her fingers resting lightly on the podium. But sometimes silence is a seed, and given time, it blooms where noise once dominated. Her words weren't aimed at anyone in particular, yet every syllable found its target. As the room applauded again, a soft chorus of admiration sweeping from table to table, Simone reached for a glass of wine not to celebrate, but to steady her fingers. She sipped and smiled as if unbothered, but inside the taste was sour. The dress she wore, the shoes that clicked like a metronome of pride, all of it now felt like a costume in a play where she had been demoted from lead to extra. And when Elaine descended from the podium and joined Hugo at the table reserved for VIPs, Simone felt something worse than anger. She felt erased. The lights continued to shine, the cameras continued to flash, but they no longer saw her. In a room she thought she'd own, she was merely furniture, pretty, expensive-looking, and utterly replaceable. The night, which was supposed to be her coronation, had become her quiet exile. The morning after the launch event didn't come with sunshine for Simone. It came with silence, and it was louder than any thunder. The phone that used to ring with admiration now buzzed with cold notifications, untagged photos, removed mentions, subtle unfollows. In the digital world where she had built her castle of attention, the moat had dried, and the walls crumbled overnight. Her inbox was quiet, not from absence of data, but because no one cared to follow up. The photos that once framed her as the spotlight now seemed like awkward shadows of someone who tried too hard to be permanent in a role never assigned to her. She opened Instagram and saw pictures of Elaine, not in party gowns or dramatic poses, but seated beside Hugo in soft interviews, smiling with the composure of a woman who had learned that class never shouts. Simone closed the app, her chest heavy like a wardrobe filled with regrets. In her small apartment, surrounded by shoes she once thought were her ticket to the top, she replayed every second of the launch night, how the applause shifted, how Derek didn't reach for her hand, how the cameras turned away like she'd become old news before the story even made it to print. She tried to speak to herself aloud, to claim it was a misunderstanding, but her voice lacked conviction. All the rehearsed affirmations in her mirror now felt like expired mantras. And worst of all, the silence from Derek was now stretching like a wire pulled too tight. It hadn't snapped, but it was close. Derek, too, was spiraling, though his descent came not with public shame, but private disarray. The moment Elaine stepped into the spotlight at that event, something unspoken tore through him. Not anger, not guilt, but a realization that what he thought he could outsmart had already outrun him. The woman he had once described as quiet and soft had emerged like an iceberg beneath the waves, far bigger, far deeper than he ever gave her credit for. His emails were flooded with congratulatory notes about Hugo's new partner, and everywhere he turned, people mentioned Elaine's insights, Elaine's pitch deck, Elaine's strategy. Suddenly, the name that used to live quietly beside his had taken on a roar of its own. He found himself tiptoeing in his own office, unsure if any of his staff now respected him or simply tolerated him. He tried reaching out to Hugo for a casual lunch, but the assistant replied with a vague, "Mr. James's calendar is quite full this month." That alone cut deeper than a blade. At home, he returned to silence. Elaine didn't argue. She didn't mention the launch. She simply moved with a poise that spoke volumes. She took phone calls in the study. She scheduled early morning strategy calls, and when he walked in mid-discussion, her words didn't pause to include him. The subtle shift in power wasn't loud, but it was seismic. She no longer looked like the woman he had abandoned emotionally. She looked like someone who had shed her skin and kept the diamond underneath. Simone tried calling Derek 3 times. Each time, it rang out like a song that knew it wasn't welcome. On the 4th try, it went straight to voicemail. She stared at her screen as if it had betrayed her. There had been no official breakup, no message that spelled the end, but everything around her reeked of dismissal. Her name had been removed from the brand campaign. The PR team no longer responded to her inquiries. And worst of all, her photos from the launch event were carefully cropped in articles, her presence edited out like a smudge on an otherwise perfect picture. She paced her room with a phone in one hand and a rage that had nowhere to go in the other. She knew better than to walk into the office and confront Derek. That would be social suicide. Yet the stillness was unbearable. She didn't understand how Elaine could look so calm, so unbothered, so complete. Weren't wives supposed to break down when their husbands strayed? Simone had expected war, or at least a teary confrontation. But instead, the woman had walked in like she owned the building and walked out with the spotlight. Simone began questioning everything, not just the affair, but herself. Was she ever loved, or was she just a convenience wrapped in perfume? She scrolled through old texts from Derek, trying to find a promise worth fighting for. But each message now sounded hollow. She had been the echo of someone else's broken story, and now the room had emptied, leaving her alone with only the sound of her own fading illusion. Elaine, meanwhile, wasn't basking in revenge. She wasn't plotting another move or rehearsing any gloating speeches. She had nothing to prove, not to Simone, not to Derek, not even to herself. Her rise wasn't for applause. It was survival dressed as success. She spent her afternoons reviewing investor memos and her evenings watering the small plants on the apartment balcony. Simple things, grounding things. She no longer waited for Derek to notice her. His attention had become background noise in a symphony she no longer played in. When he finally mustered the courage to speak one evening, something vague about how things had changed lately, Elaine looked at him, not with anger, but with a kindness that felt like closure. "Change is the price of staying still for too long," she said quietly, then returned to her notes. It wasn't cruel. It was final. The kind of statement that doesn't slam doors, but seals them gently. Derek didn't respond. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer, then left. Elaine exhaled deeply, not out of pain, but peace. The woman who had once dimmed her light to make someone else comfortable had now learned to shine without burning bridges. And in that glow, she found something better than vindication. She found herself. The days that followed unfolded with a kind of slowness that wasn't peaceful. It was calculated. Greystone's corporate spaces buzzed with speculation, but no one dared speak too directly. The whispers didn't carry names, just phrases like shift in power and unexpected turn. Derek moved through the office like a man who had misplaced his shadow, present but oddly dulled. His suits were still ironed, his watch still gold, but the confidence he once carried had drained from his shoulders like water through a cracked pipe. At meetings, people nodded at his words, but quoted Elaine's proposals. She wasn't just the CEO's partner anymore. She was the woman behind a restructuring proposal that had saved the company millions. Her insights circulated like scripture among department heads. Derek knew her thoughts before she spoke them, because everyone else repeated them first. He tried to reassert authority, to speak louder in boardrooms and smile wider at brunches, but it was like throwing stones into the ocean, no ripples, no recognition. At home, silence greeted him. Elaine had mastered the art of making absence feel like a presence. Her laughter didn't fill the house, yet her presence lingered in every corner, dignified and resolute. It unnerved him that she didn't seem to need a confrontation. He wanted her to shout, to ask why, to demand what he could no longer defend. But she didn't. She existed like time, moving forward, without waiting for him to catch up. And that, more than anything, crushed him. Simone, on the other hand, felt like she had fallen into a well with no echo, no way to scream, no one to hear. The glitter that once coated her days had turned into invisible dust, staining everything she touched with quiet disgrace. Friends she used to gossip with began declining her invitations with vague apologies. Her stylist didn't return messages. The boutique she used to model for started tagging newer, younger influencers. Even her landlord began asking questions when rent came in a week late. One afternoon, while sitting alone at the edge of a nearly empty cafe, she stared into her half-empty glass of lemon tea like it held answers. The world had not ended, but hers had changed, and it wasn't waiting for her to adjust. A notification buzzed on her phone. An online magazine had published a profile of Elaine titled "The Woman Who Redefined Power in Greystone." Simone clicked, her eyes scanning the headline like it mocked her in every font. The article wasn't showy, it was sincere. It spoke about quiet transformation, business acumen, emotional resilience. No jabs, no drama. Just the story of a woman who rebuilt herself where she had once been broken. Simone read the article twice, then again. Each line felt like a mirror turned against her own choices. For the first time, she didn't feel like the victim of a betrayal. She felt like the architect of her own ruin, laying bricks of pride on foundations made of assumption. And that realization didn't sting. It shattered. It shattered. Eyes buried down, and the vol raise making McGinnis, Forderde. Doride de Camperge, Colme Verturi, Cornegalt, a report, Toretior den Bentrid and Sauce, Combat Tankspix, Meted et Schrick and Betteritanis. Jorpenet and is it, word Perede Tanks Spoid up I Perat. Perede and Corneta Fernandidis, word in Benga Toys. Only the Tricket and Pinkin at Tide, Lassiter and Reddis clandered, could be the squatter the cheat and trust. Pert war the twag were to charities, or big thing into it. But you'll to be winners, or in the file. With Elaine continued to move with the poise of someone who had nothing to prove. She didn't chase interviews, nor did she decline them. She answered questions with measured thought, always redirecting praise toward teamwork and vision. When asked about her sudden emergence into the business spotlight, she smiled and said, "I didn't emerge. I just stopped hiding." Her words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were laced with lived truth. In the office, interns admired her like a mentor from a dream, while executives respected her like a storm they couldn't predict but had learned to prepare for. Yet Elaine remained grounded. She still walked home on days when she didn't feel like driving. Still bought flowers from the old woman on Pelican Street who never asked too many questions. Still journaled at night under the soft glow of a lamp that had outlived 2 apartments and 1 illusion of love. She didn't need revenge because she had rewritten her joy. And somewhere in that quiet bloom, she forgave Derek, not in a grand gesture, but in a soft decision made while folding laundry one Saturday morning. She simply let the weight go, not because he deserved release, but because she did. And when she looked in the mirror now, she didn't see a survivor. She saw a woman who had become her own answer. One Wednesday evening, the board hosted a private dinner in honor of the firm's new strategic direction. Hugo invited Elaine to speak briefly, and though she accepted, she made it clear she wouldn't be reading from a script. She stood at the center of a warmly lit hall, dressed in an emerald blouse tucked into soft brown trousers. Nothing extravagant, just elegant truth. Her words flowed not like a speech, but like a conversation. "Sometimes," she began, "life will give you a mirror not to show your reflection, but to reveal who's standing behind you when you're not looking." The room was silent. "I learned that when storms come, you don't always need an umbrella. Sometimes you need to let the rain wash you clean." Simone watched from a table at the back, uninvited but present through a friend's plus. One. Her throat was dry. It wasn't jealousy that gripped her. It was clarity. For all the perfume and poses she had worn, she had never known the kind of strength Elaine displayed with just her eyes. As the evening ended, guests gathered around Elaine, praising her, thanking her, shaking her hand. No cameras needed to be staged. No moments needed retakes. She had become the kind of woman that silence applauds. And from across the room, where lights were dimmer and applause didn't reach, Simone stood like a painting no one had hung properly. She smiled faintly, knowing full well that this wasn't just the end of a season. It was the moment when the stage had closed on a script she was never truly written into. The days blurred into weeks, and Greystone moved on as cities often do, unbothered by the personal ruins it leaves behind. In the quiet of her apartment, Simone began to taste the bitterness of decisions made in haste and pride. The clothes she once wore like armor now felt like costumes from a show that had been canceled without warning. She no longer rehearsed her laugh in the mirror or planned Instagram captions in advance. The mirror had stopped applauding. Every corner of her space reminded her of the woman she had tried to become, the candles with names like power and desire, the framed vision board that now felt more like satire than prophecy, and the empty shoeboxes that once held designer heels she'd worn like promises. Simone wasn't bitter anymore. She was bruised by truth. She had played a game she thought she understood, but the rules were written in a language she never learned. Self-worth, grace, restraint. She applied for a role at a branding agency out of town, hoping to disappear before the whispers followed her too long. But in the hush between job rejections and uncertain mornings, she began journaling, not like Elaine, not for inspiration, but for confession. She wrote things she'd never said aloud, that she never really loved Derek, that she wanted to feel seen more than she wanted to be chosen, that being admired wasn't the same as being respected. And as her pen moved, slowly at first, then freely, she felt something loosen inside her, a knot that had pretended to be confidence unraveling into real honesty. Derek, meanwhile, was living in the residue of regret, the kind that doesn't scream or slam doors, but lingers in air like stale perfume. He moved through his days in stiff routines, attending meetings, reviewing reports, and trying to pretend the world hadn't tilted beneath his feet. But nothing sat quite right anymore. His coffee didn't taste the same, his shirts didn't fit the way they used to, and the office greetings had gone from warm to merely polite. He avoided the news columns because every now and then Elaine's name would appear again, always attached to words like visionary, restorative leader, or industry reformation. He hadn't spoken to her in days, and it was clear she no longer felt the need to include him in anything that didn't legally require his name. The divorce papers hadn't come yet, but her silence was louder than any lawyer. He found himself driving past places they once visited, an art gallery she used to love, a quiet pier where she once sat for hours journaling. The memory of her used to be small, background music to the louder songs he thought he preferred. Now it had become a symphony that underscored every room he entered. He even considered reaching out to Simone again, but stopped himself. Not out of guilt, but because the emptiness he carried wasn't hers to fix. He had built his life on the scaffolding of charm and shortcuts, and now that structure trembled with every passing day. The worst part wasn't that he had lost Elaine. The worst part was knowing he had never truly deserved her. Elaine was not waiting for closure. She had already folded it neatly into her drawer like a letter she no longer needed to reread. She spent her mornings in structured rhythms, emails, strategy calls, quiet breakfasts, a walk through the city before noon. Her face had changed, not in appearance, but in posture. She no longer looked like someone trying to hold it together. She looked like someone who had already let go. Occasionally, she ran into familiar faces who mentioned Derek with caution, unsure of where she stood. She always responded with the same calm, "I wish him well," and moved on. There was no venom left to squeeze. One morning, while walking through Maple District, she passed a young woman arguing on the phone in a tone that reminded her of her former self, pleading, bending, justifying. Elaine slowed her pace and watched for a second longer than necessary. Not to judge, but to remember. She had been that woman once, so desperate to keep someone who was already walking away in spirit. Now she knew better. Love, when it is real, doesn't need to be chased like a cab on a rainy day. It waits. It shows up. It builds. And when it leaves, it doesn't leave you crumbling. Elaine returned home that day, opened her journal, and wrote, "Healing doesn't always look like dancing. It sometimes looks like sitting still long enough to feel the ground under your feet again." And in that stillness, she felt peace blooming like a shy flower under soft morning rain. One quiet evening, Elaine received an invitation to speak at a tech conference in another city. It was a prestigious event, a gathering of innovators, CEOs, and investors, the kind of space where her voice would not only echo, but matter. She accepted, not for show, but because she was finally stepping into rooms built for her voice. As she packed her suitcase, folding her clothes with care, Derek sat alone in their former apartment, surrounded by furniture that now felt like strangers. He saw the envelope Elaine had left on the dining table. It wasn't thick or official, just a small handwritten note. He opened it slowly, the way a man opens the last photograph of something lost. It read, "Some storms don't destroy, they clear the path. I hope one day you learn to walk without stepping over people." There was no signature, no accusation, just truth, and it cut cleanly. Meanwhile, in a modest hotel room 2 cities away, Simone sat at the edge of her bed in a company t-shirt, typing her first official brand copy for her new agency. It wasn't glamorous, and no one clapped when she finished. But for the first time in a long while, she felt useful. Not adored, not envied, just grounded. As she closed her laptop, she looked out the window into the sleepy town beyond. She whispered to herself, "It's not too late to become someone better." And maybe it wasn't. Maybe shame, after all, wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the start of silence, finally teaching what applause never could. The conference room in New Belmont glowed with the soft elegance of curated success, walnut podiums, velvet chairs, and amber lighting that seemed to understand the importance of its guests. Elaine stood backstage, her outline cast against the curtain like a silhouette waiting for daylight. Her name had already been printed in the program booklet beside words like innovation architect and visionary strategist, but none of those titles carried more weight than the quiet knowing in her bones. She wasn't here to prove a point. She was here because she had become the kind of woman who belonged in spaces like this. The host introduced her not with exaggerated flair, but with earned reverence. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience rose, not just in courtesy, but in recognition. She walked with no rush, no need for spectacle. She stood behind the microphone like it was just another journal waiting to be spoken into. We often think that power is volume, she began, her voice smooth but grounded, but in my experience, the strongest voices often come after seasons of silence. Heads nodded, phones clicked photos, pens scribbled notes. But beyond the applause, Elaine's heart remained anchored. She was not the sum of what had happened to her. She was the result of what she had done with it. And in that truth, she found the kind of closure that doesn't slam doors, it simply stops knocking. When she finished, the applause didn't erupt. It blossomed. Soft, deep, and long, like people had heard something that healed them. Elsewhere in Greystone, Derek sat alone at a small cafe where he and Elaine used to meet before everything grew complicated. He didn't order anything, just sat at the corner table, watching couples pass with the indifference of someone no longer in the scene but too restless to leave the theater. He hadn't heard from Simone since their last awkward message exchange, one that ended with a take care that carried more weight than goodbye. He knew he had no role in Elaine's life now. That much was clear. But what gnawed at him wasn't her absence. It was the absence of the man he thought he was. He kept turning over moments in his head like mismatched coins in an old drawer, trying to find where exactly it all slipped away. Was it when he stopped listening? When he traded trust for temptation? Or when he started believing that someone's quietness meant irrelevance? The truth was, he hadn't just lost Elaine. He had missed the point entirely. And now, even the city seemed to whisper reminders, her name in conference ads, her voice in recorded interviews played at networking events, her ideas passed along in rooms he no longer entered. He thought about calling her, just once, maybe to say sorry, maybe to say nothing. But he knew that not all stories needed an epilogue. Some are better left with the lesson carved into silence, like initials on a tree that no longer shades you. In a smaller town far from the buzzing veins of Greystone, Simone woke to the sound of church bells, not because she was religious, but because her new apartment sat 2 buildings from a local chapel that didn't believe in quiet mornings. She sat up slowly, the mattress slightly uneven, but hers all the same. Her phone no longer buzzed with false promises or curated chaos. She had taken a job as a junior content developer, a position many would consider a step down, but for her, it was a recalibration. She walked to work now, sometimes past street vendors who called her auntie even though she wasn't old enough for the title. She wore flat shoes, carried a lunch bag, and answered emails without pretending to be someone she wasn't. Each evening, she sat by her small window, watched children chase each other in the dust, and wrote in her notebook, not for followers, not for likes, just for herself. It was in one of those entries that she wrote something she'd never forget. Vanity gives you a seat at the table, but wisdom gives you a reason to be there. That sentence became a truth she carried like a compass. She no longer searched for applause. She searched for growth. And for the first time in years, she began to feel like a woman who wasn't running from shame, but learning from it, barefoot and honest. Time passed as it always does, not in grand leaps, but in the quiet turning of ordinary days. Elaine eventually moved to a different city, Closer to the coast, where the morning smelled like salt and second chances, she bought a small home, not for status, but for solitude. There, she began teaching young entrepreneurs, not in universities or seminars, but in one-on-one mentorships where stories mattered more than resumes. She never spoke ill of Derek. She never mentioned Simone. Her past was not a wound anymore. It was a well. And from that well, she drew strength, not to remember pain, but to refresh others. One Saturday morning, while sipping tea on her porch and watching the sunrise stain the sea with color, a young mentee asked her what changed everything for her. Elaine smiled, not the kind that needed to be understood, but the kind that simply knew. "I stopped asking who broke me," she said, "and started asking what I could build." And as the wind rolled over the waves like a hymn, the house behind her warm with peace, the path ahead open as the horizon, she knew, without a doubt, that some endings don't need applause to feel complete. Sometimes it's enough to have walked through fire and come out as light. And for those who once doubted her quiet, they had now learned it wasn't silence. It was the sound of something sacred, becoming. In life, never mistake silence for weakness, and never trade your dignity for attention. Beauty might turn heads, but character builds foundations. If someone overlooks your worth, don't chase, rebuild. True strength is not in how loud you speak, but in how deeply you know who you are. When your moment comes, let your growth speak louder than your pain ever did. May you never lose yourself trying to prove your worth to those who don't know how to value gold when it's quiet. May your journey be filled with grace that doesn't need noise to shine. When doors close, may new ones open, not because you begged, but because you prepared. May your healing be silent but powerful, your peace unshakable, and your purpose louder than your past. May you rise from broken places with wisdom in your steps and joy in your bones. And when shame tries to wear heels around you, may you stand taller, not in pride, but in truth. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.